Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Indigenous Arts Intensive at UBC Okanagan. I'm Tanya Willard. I'm the coordinator for the intensive and assistant professor in visual arts with the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies at UBC Okanagan. In UBC Okanagan, the Kelowna campus is in the traditional territories of the Syilx Nation, and I want to extend an acknowledgement of Syilx unceded territories, and more than that, to think about deepening the ways in which we are not only aware of and acknowledge unceded territories we're in, but I take on a level of thinking responsibly about how I contribute back as an uninvited guest. I'm from the Secwepemc Nation, and I'm here in Secwepemc today. And I know that many of you are in different Indigenous territories and locations, as well as thinking of even our format in terms of Zoom and YouTube and the huge footprint, actually, of a number of those platforms in the physical world and within Indigenous territories. And so this is something that I'm thinking about quite deeply, and that we invite you to think about the ways in which land acknowledgement can be furthered, and engagement with and advocacy for and solidarity with the Indigenous territories and communities you find yourself from and within. The theme of the UBC Okanagan Indigenous Art Intensive is this idea of citation, and not in the sense of a text academic citation, but of site specificity, which we talk about in contemporary art practice, in situ, the idea that the site, and I further this by saying the land in which we're creating and working from, also contains within it a constellation of knowledge, and that constellation of knowledge is something that the Indigenous territories, the Indigenous communities from that land are richly engaged and nurtured and responsible to and within. And so these are ideas that we've been thinking about in the intensive, with the idea of sight and the idea of the land as a source of knowledge. And that brings me to our really exciting keynote today with Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, and her incredible contribution to Indigenous critical writing, thinking, music, the ways in which she has provided such an important platform for considering this idea of land-based knowledge, and all her teaching contributions within that. Leanne Simpson is a renowned Michi Sagig Nishnabeg scholar, writer, and artist who has been widely recognized as one of the most compelling Indigenous voices of her generation. Her work breaks open the intersections between politics, story, and song, bringing audiences into a rich and layered world of sound, light, and sovereign creativity. Working for 2 decades as an independent scholar using Nishnabeg intellectual practices, Leanne has lectured and taught extensively at universities across Canada and the United States, and has 20 years experience with Indigenous land-based education. She holds a PhD from the University of Manitoba and teaches at the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning in Denenda. Leanne is the author of 6 previous books, including her new novel, Nopaming, The Cure for White Ladies, which was named the best book of the year by Globe and Mail. The Accident of Being Lost won the MacEwan University Book of the Year, was a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Trillium Book Award, was longlisted for CBC Canada Reads, and was named the best book of the year by the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and Quill and Choir. As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance was awarded Best Subsequent Book by the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. A Short History of the Blockade, Giant Beavers, Diplomacy, and Regeneration in Nishnabewin is a forthcoming from the University of Alberta Press in 2021. And her new project collaboration with Robin Maynard, Rehearsals for Living, Conversations on Abolition and Anti-Colonialism, is forthcoming from Not Canada in 2022. Leanne launches our first keynote for the Indigenous Art Intensive, and I'm just so honored that Leanne has agreed to present and share some of her work that we are finding so inspirational and groundbreaking in the work that we do. So I ask you all to virtually welcome Leanne here, and we will follow with a Q&A. Leanne's going to present. We will follow with a question and answer period, and I will also be in conversation with Leanne following. So thank you so much, Leanne.
Thank you, Tanya. Bojo Kinawaya, Gidagavijina Denewema, Kinagachi Nishnabek Oguming Nadonjaba, Nagojawani Megwadoda, Betasamosake Indigenous cause. Thank you, Tanya, so much for inviting me to visit with this group. I also want to give a shout out to Scott, who's running the show behind the scenes and is providing a lot of really wonderful technical support so that we don't have to worry about that. So thank you, Scott. And thank you all for coming and sharing either your stay-at-home order or your holiday weekend, your holiday Monday with us. I am Michi Sagik Nishnabek or Ojibwe, and my territory is roughly the North Shore of Lake Ontario. My particular understanding of life comes from this part of the world. It comes from this Michi Sagik practice of life, living in deep relationality to the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and the peoples of Kinagachi and Nishnabek Oguming, the place where we all live and work together. It comes from Neyano Nibimong Gichigaming, or the Great Lakes. It comes from maple sugar bushes carrying and filtering water from the soil, combining it with light and converting it to sweet sugar. It comes from lake shores full of monomen or wild rice, gathering strength in mid-July and moving from floating form to standing upright. It comes from black bears that wake up in Makwagizis or February, turn in their dens on bed of blueberry branches, and then settle back down into fasting and dreaming for a few more weeks. The land has taught me that Anishinaabe life is continual, reciprocal, and reflective. It is a sometimes critical engagement with my ancestors, those yet to be born, and the nations of beings with whom I share land. It is a living constellation of co-resistance with all of the anti-colonial peoples and the worlds they build. This land has taught me that Anishinaabe life is a persistent world-building process, despite of and in spite of colonial imposition and the constant machinery of death. This procedure for Indigenous life and Indigenous living is one that Indigenous people used long before our existence ever depended upon our ability to resist and survive the violence of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and expansive and recursive dispossession. My ancestors woke up each morning and created an Anishinaabe world. They animated their political system of governance and diplomacy. They built their collective philosophical and ethical understandings. They made processes for solving conflict and reestablishing balance. And they built their economy with the consent of plant and animal nations. They built, maintained, and nurtured systems for sharing knowledge and taking care of each other. They worked collectively to produce, reproduce, replicate, amplify, and share Anishinaabe life, because if they did not, Anishinaabe worlds wouldn't exist. They were makers. They got up each morning and they worked hard, not the white man wage labor, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of work, not the kind of work where you outsource the labor of living so you can do something more important, but the kind of work that values above all else the way one lives. They got up, worked hard all day long in a way that brought forth more life. This algorithm of living, theory, and praxis, seemingly seamlessly intertwined and relationally responsive to each other, is generated through intimate relations with Michi-Sagi land that is constructed and defined by our intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and physical relationship with it. Living as a creative act, self-determination, consent, kindness, and freedom practiced daily in all our relation. Practices replicated over and over. The practice of making as the material basis for experiencing and influencing the world. Living with the purpose of generating more life. Our infrastructure for life was relationships, not institutions. Our orientation for life was internationalist. We shared space and time with plant and animal nations and different indigenous nations, mostly without the use of enclosures and violence. We didn't bank capital to protect us against hard times. We had interdependent relationships with other animal and plant nations, other human families, and neighboring indigenous nations. In times of difficulty, we relied upon this practice of relational diplomacy and the world it creates to survive, with the understanding that in return, we would also take care of their worlds. Of course, and I know this audience knows this, we've always been intellectual and artistic people. We have always had theory, meaning, philosophy, and aesthetic principles. These were not individual pursuits. They were communal making practices. Everyone had their own stories and their own songs and their own voice, and those things were considered and celebrated and then woven together into layered collective understandings. My people are constant storytellers throughout the day and throughout the seasons. Stories are a fabric of daily life. The sonics of story pulls one into space where worlds are fully embodied experiences. The sound is the connector to emotions and intellect beyond one's own body. They're the connector to all of the relations that make up the land holds story. From this is the place where you were to when you got stung by this bee and fell into a beaver pond, to before that monster cottage was built on that island, your great-grandparents always camped there on the way to town, to remember that time Nana Bush transformed into a tree but forgot that one body part, to the place where you first tasted smart berries, and look, there are geese flying overhead in a V. Stories not only fill our worlds, they make our worlds, but only if you have the skills to find meaning in oral literature, but only if story lives and breathes inside of you, but only if you wrap stories around you like a blanket and take them out to consider from time to time. Telling stories is a foundational practice of Indigenous peoples. The practice of telling stories fills interstitial spaces of worlds with recognition and affirmation, with all of its generative and degenerative energies. It's a practice of listening with one's open heart to the sound of an Anishinaabe across time and space in all of our beautiful manifestations. The practice of telling stories is the practice of generating a diversity of meanings. It is a practice of deep relationality, not a looking at, but a looking with, or a looking through, or a thinking through together. The practice of telling stories is a practice of scaling and releasing sound across scales, articulating our individual experiences, relating them to collective experiences, and generating systemic critique. More important than telling is the culture of listening. The practice of telling stories is the practice of constantly building Anishinaabe worlds while simultaneously living in them. We are bodies made of stories and connection, hubs in the network of Indigenous living, and our practice of stories is one of the reasons that I'm here today, in spite of centuries of colonial violence. This is the context that I live and work and think and create in. And this is the context that created the novel Nopaming, The Cure for White Ladies, that I'm going to be talking about and sharing with you today. To begin with, I'd like to start with the cover image. Of course, I know that you'll recognize that this is an image from Rebecca Belmore's called Fringe. It was first installed in 2007 in Montreal in a light box as part of a photography festival. And I remember taking my kids actually to the planetarium and standing on the street and sort of being stunned by this image. Can we have the next slide? Rebecca, in conversation with Kathleen Ritter at the Vancouver Art Gallery in April 2008, said, "As an Indigenous woman, my female body speaks for itself. Some people interpret the image of this reclining figure as a cadaver. However, to me, it is a wound that is on the mend. It wasn't self-inflicted, but nonetheless, it is bearable. She can sustain it." So it's a very simple scenario. She will get up and go on, but she will carry the mark with her. She will turn her back on the atrocities inflicted upon her body and find resilience in the future. The Indigenous female body is the politicized body, the historical body. It's the body that doesn't disappear. So when I encountered this image, I came to know that kind of the figure as genderless in a way. I liked the idea that the trauma is acknowledged, but we don't stay in it. There's movement and there's traveling from it. The gash and the sewing up reminded me of that stage in hide tanning where you stitch up the holes. It reminded me of those old ladies stitching up the holes of the hide before they smoke it. It reminded me of my mom stitching up holes in my clothes, of fixing things. It also, I think for me, gestures towards Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson's work in a paper that she published in Theory and Event called The State is a Man, Teresa Spence, Loretta Saunders, and the Gender of Settler Sovereignty. And Audra writes about the female body or queer bodies as a political order, an embodied political economy, an embodied ethic, and a threat to settler sovereignty, and therefore something that from the perspective of settler colonialism needs to be eliminated. And so that image to me was the perfect image for this book, Nopaming. If we can move to the next slide. In Rebecca Belmore's Facing the Monumental exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2018, one of the installations was Tower, which is a tower of shopping carts. And encountering that, I feel like this was the last time I was at an art gallery before COVID, and I didn't know it would be the last time. But I was really struck by the tools, and I was writing Nopaming, and I think this is where the Natik, which is the maple tree character in the novel, gets the idea to push the shopping cart. And also I was thinking before I got to Facing the Monumental about the tarp and the use of tarps in Anishinaabe life, from everything from shelter to blanket to throwing it over the wood pile to I don't know, just the usefulness of tarps, but then also complicated with that is sort of the plastic nature. So maybe the next slide would be good. So seeing tarpaulin sort of affirmed this for me. And then we need to go back to the cover of the book now in terms of slides. Thank you. So nopaming is a word in my language which means in the bush. And it is a reference to a book that was written in 1852 by Susanna Moodie, who was a white woman, called Roughing It in the Bush. And Roughing It in the Bush was a sort of guidebook for settlers coming to Canada, coming to Upper Canada, coming specifically to the area around Cobourg and Peterborough, so Michi-Saagiik and Anishinaabeg territory. And of course, this book was really canonical in CanLit. So could we go to the slide of, yeah. This book is part of the literary canon. It's something that's very celebrated because it's one of the first books in Canada written by a white woman, a woman. It's inspired a lot of literature. So Margaret Atwood has used it as a jumping off point, and so has Carol Shields. And I've read the book at different points in my life because I really believe it's important to sort of engage intellectually with everything that's out there. And this is this book from a very particular time and a very particular period where there isn't a lot of written records. And so Michi-Saagiik people appear in the book in a pretty prominent way. Moodie talks about our chiefs. She talks about specific families. She's very racist. And it's a very unsettling read, but at the same time, it's this window into the time, and not just the time, it's a window into white supremacy. It's also very anti-Black. So I wanted to sort of write something that was in conversation with Roughing It in the Bush, but also kind of at the same time refusing to be in conversation, refusing that conversation. I wanted to use it as a jumping off point. I wanted to build an Anishinaabe world in the present that were beautiful and joyful and smart and funny. And I wanted to demonstrate that when you come into my territory with the glasses of white supremacy, you are going to miss all of this, and you're going to build a world on top of these beautiful worlds, and you're going to destroy them. So a lot of folks have asked me, after the title, after Nopaming and the Cure for White Ladies, you don't really refer to Susanna Moodie and the rest of the novel, and that is correct, because I wanted to sort of fall into this gorgeous Anishinaabe world and not look back. So maybe back to the book cover. So I set out in this book, I had up until now been writing short stories and poetry and music and academic work. And I set out to write something in a longer form, which was challenging for me to begin with. But the more that I sort of immersed myself in the idea of a novel, the more I got shut down. It became so clear to me that a novel is very steeped in Western thought and these very rigid Western storytelling structures and traditions: protagonist, antagonist, good versus evil, plot, setting, conflict. And I found it so hard to work within that structure. I found it really just shut down my creativity altogether. And so my background is in Anishinaabe storytelling, and I decided to sort of reject that Western idea of a novel and let Anishinaabe storytelling practices be the guide, knowing that this was going to lead to a book that was structured very, very differently. And ultimately it was going to lead to a very, very different reading experience. So I think when I made that decision artistically, I was like, I sort of had to accept that maybe the book wasn't going to win any prizes, or maybe it wasn't even going to get published. maybe it wasn't going to be successful because it was going to be more challenging, I think, to a non-Indigenous reader and a non-Indigenous publisher than my other work. And I accepted that. Because really I didn't have any other choice. I couldn't bring myself to write the novel like you're supposed to. So it definitely is, this book builds on my academic work and as we have always done, but it's instead of, that academic authoritarian voice telling you, I'm trying to show. It builds on Islands of Decolonial Love and This Accident of Being Lost. There are reoccurring characters, there's reoccurring themes, and I use a lot of Anishinaabe aesthetics. One of the first things I thought about in the book was the idea of time and space. There's a lot of really excellent work being done right now in art and in writing and in the academy around Indigenous futurisms and Indigenous futures. I myself find myself fascinated and engaged with the present, because of course the present gives birth to the future. The present is the planting of the seeds. The future is the harvest or the garden. I was giving a presentation with Susan Blight, and she was talking about a teaching that Alex McKay had given her around the word Badabin. Badabin is a word that is the first light of dawn. So that first light that comes up on the horizon before the sun has risen in the morning. And he had broke down the word into its three little bits, and the be, meaning the future, is coming at you. The da, meaning the present or home, and ba or ban, which is a suffix that you would put on the end of somebody's name after they had passed on. So it denotes the past. So I wrote a lot of this book in the morning, very early in the morning, because I'm a parent, and that's when I have time to myself, watching the sunrise and thinking about this word Badab, and thinking about how that teaching from Alex that I got through Susan Blight is really this saying that the present, that moment that we have, the moment that we're all in, is a collapsing in of the past and the future in on itself. And that became something that was sort of an organizing concept, I guess, in the book. One of the characters starts out as Lucy and transforms and is named in Anishinaabe by the end of the book and carries that name. I thought a lot about relationality, sort of a very deep relationality, because sometimes I think the way that we talk about relationships and relationality in this moment is pretty superficial. It can be superficial. And I wanted to take sort of the complexity of deep relationality, so being related to not just my family, but the plants and animal nations and waters and earth that I'm sharing time and space with. Also my ancestors and those yet to be born, and how that kind of creates a network of complex, deep, messy relationality. And I wanted that to sort of, that kind of a network idea to become the setting of the book. And so the characters in the books are humans of all ages, Anishinaabe humans of all ages, animals. There's a caribou character, trees, there's a maple tree Nanata character. There's sort of elder spirit, some ambiguity around Akawenze, Mindamoy, and Sabe. And there's lots of birds and water. I was thinking of the characters and their bodies as not sort of bodies or I guess kind of closed off vessels, but as nodes in this network. So a body then becomes a summation of all of the different relationality across time and space. And that sort of fit into the idea of in Anishinaabe thought, how we have living and non-living things. And that's sort of a bigger division than humans or body and mind, or humans and plants and animals. like that initial Rebecca Belmore image, I wanted to sort of push the trauma to the margins of this book. It bothers me, I think, in my gut, how I think non-Indigenous Canadian reading public sort of gobbles up Indigenous trauma. And I think it's really important for us to be able to tell our stories on our own terms. And I know that so many of our personal stories carry that trauma. And so I have nothing but respect for writers and artists who are talking about those issues. And for this book, I wanted to push it to the side and just create this space and hold space for Anishinaabe life, for Anishinaabe life and joy, and sort of put a boundary around the consumption of that. I thought a lot about recoding in this book. I thought a lot about property and belongings. And so each of the main characters, each of the 7 main characters has sort of some special things that are precious to them that they carry around. And I was thinking about how if those special things are property, or if those are belongings, if they are actually extensions of the body and extensions of spirit. And so that is part of the book. All of the characters in the book use they, them pronouns. I wanted to have an Anishinaabe expansive idea of gender. In our language, we don't have gendered pronouns, so that made sense. You can gender them, but you have to be very specific around that. I also think that use of they, them reinforced the idea of bodies being the summation of all of the kind of deep and layered relationships that you're in. If you've read the book, you'll encounter that there's a lot of kind of space. Sometimes there's only 1 sentence or 2 sentences on the page, and there's a lot of blank space, which really slows down, I think, the reading process. It allows for reflection. It's sort of an affirmation of those quiet times, I think, in Indigenous conversation where particularly old people aren't just filling up the room with sound or with chit chat, but they're very deliberate about when they speak and why they speak. There's sort of a circular nature to the story, in that I think you could probably start the book at any point on any page and then read around to that page again. I thought a lot about audience in the book. I really wanted to make something for and with Anishinaabe people. I wanted Indigenous people to be able to see themselves in the pages, and to not have those little markers where you're explaining language or where you're explaining an inside joke, that also become markers to tell Indigenous readers that this isn't actually for you. This is actually being catered and written for a wide audience. I tried to use that Anishinaabe aesthetic of layering meaning and coding meaning, both in the words and also, I think, in sort of the artistic projects and collaborations that have come out of the book. I wasn't sort of interested in selling a lot of copies or that kind of thing. I was interested to see how the book would travel in the world and how people would engage with it and how other artists would engage with it or not engage with it and interpret it. So because of that kind of idea that I wanted to see how it would travel and take on a life of its own in its world. There's some other kind of projects that came out of the book that I'm going to talk about now. And so maybe we could move to the next slide. This is my sister Ansley and me. I guess you recognize me because I'm on the screen. Ansley is a singer-songwriter who's based in Toronto, and the book was in production at the beginning of the pandemic. So over a year ago now, and I was wondering how the book was going to find readers and engage with people, because everything was being canceled and everything was shut down. And so Ansley and I came up with the idea of recording 4 readings, excerpts from the book, over original music that she composed and played with the assistance of James Button. And we made an album called the Nopaming Sessions, which you can find on Bandcamp. And we released it through her album Gejiwe, which is an Anishinaabe word that means singing with a loud voice. The album art for Nopaming Sessions, which you can see now, is an illustration, an image by the Northern Tushone artist Leanne Charlie. And I really loved that image for a long time. And I feel like it really spoke to this work of at the beginning of the pandemic, where you're sort of, you got to make stuff with your family because that's who's around. Yeah. So as part of the Nopaming Sessions, Ansley and I reached out to Sammy Chian, who is a Taiwanese Canadian new media artist working in Vancouver, to make a video for the first track from that album, which is called Solidification. And you can see solidification, and then solidification in syllabics, and then Sammy's dad did a traditional woodblock carving for the film as well. So that's the third kind of image. Solidification was a video that we sort of had an initial Zoom conversation. Sammy was really drawn to the lyrics and the sound, and what his body, kind of the knowledge that was unlocked in his body through hearing the words and the sound. And he works with Isadora, which is a software that enables artists to create performances and installations where video, sound, and light react interactively to sensory output. So I sent Sammy the stem files from the recordings, and he used the music to each of those layers to drive the visuals. And so each track plays, and then the software sends values to the channel, and then each channel is a video channel. And so we're going to watch Solidification now, and then we'll come back. So Scott, if you could play the video.
Once you move through cold, there is Pacific. Once you move through Pacific, there is Placid. Once you move through Placid, there is a condition of expanse. And it was in that condition of expanse that held me. I heard them singing above me. Mashkawaje fell through the ice to find quiet, to get out of the wind, to visit with Namegos. They all sang Mashkawaje stitches up the hole. They are so cold, they can't move. They are frozen stiff. The lake is their blanket. They all sang Mashkawaje is frozen stiff, still, calm. No one knows if they're coming back. They all sang Akawenze is fishing through the ice with a spear. They brought a line of beads. They will wait patiently. They will wait until Mashkawaje is done their visit. The singing and drumming came every night from a distance. Different choirs every evening at dusk marking the passage of time, reminding me there is still love. You see, tragedy happened again. The details don't matter because the details are hopeless, overwhelmed, shut down. Know this, after 2 years, the best parts of me are still frozen in the lake. My limbic system, its best friend, the prefrontal cortex, and the hollow, pumping organ in which I keep benevolence. The only one that regularly comes to visit is Akawenze. In the winter, they park their truck on the ice, drill a hole with the auger and fish until the cold makes their bones crack. As soon as the ice is off the lake, Akawenze is back in their boat with a torch and a sort of pitchfork for spearing pickerel. In the dead of summer, Akawenze sneaks back before first light in their canoe, before their cottagers and their jet skis are out. In the fall, they sprinkle tobacco around me and sing. My world is muted. I look out. If something upsets me, I just wait, and the upset passes. I sit beside. Sometimes I remember the other me before I was frozen in the lake. I remember caring and engaging and the sharpness of unmuted feeling. I remember a hopeless connection. I don't feel stuck, in part because I don't feel anything. Their song isn't wrong. The ice is like a warm, weighted blanket. My form dissolved when tragedy came, and if I am fluid, the ice is container. There are ashes in my eyes. I am so far inside myself, like Miss Squatessi on a full fast, inside time, pulled inside their organs, inside their turtle shell, inside the sediments of the lake, while the ice world forms on top, oblivious to the outside with body as lake. And there is solace in being cut off, and there is freedom enmeshed within that state. Know this, being frozen in the lake is another kind of life. Know this, it is unclear how long before I will be done with my visit. It is unclear how long visiting takes. Know this, visiting is more of a dance than an event. Akawenze is my will, Nanatik is my lungs, Mindamoya is my conscience, Sabe is my marrow, Adik is my nervous system, Asin is my eyes and ears, Lucy is my brain. I believe everything these seven say because ice distorts perception and trust replaces critique, examination, interrogation. I believe everything these seven say, even though. I believe everything these seven say, even though their truths are their own, not mine. I believe in the absence of my own heart, I will accept the hearts of these seven. The geese fly overhead in the sheer grace of a carefully angled formation designed to take them elsewhere. There are still stars. There are still stars.
So that's solidification. And I think we need to move on to the next slide. The second project that's come out of Nopaming is the record, the album Theory of Ice, which came out on March 12th with You Changed Records. The album art for this project is by Nadia Meyer. That's a spelling mistake. It's Orson 4, which comes from a 2015 exhibition in response to Nadia's Scar project, or Carrying the Weight of the Scar project. And this was one of the images of the stitch pattern of Beating the Indian Act. And we actually used 2 in the vinyl record kind of album art. We used Orson 1 as well. And so Theory of Ice is, I took the series of poems that the main character, Mashkawaje is frozen in the ice. They've experienced this trauma and they rely on the other 7 characters in the book to take care of them while they're frozen in the lake, engaged in a kind of healing. And so at one point, Mashkawaje, sort of in the middle of the book, writes a series of poems called The Theory of Ice. And I took that series of poems and I brought them in conversation with my band, who is my sister Ansley again and Nick Ferrio. And Jim Bryson also helped out on the album, and John K. Sampson also sings on it. And we spent a lot of time, a number of years actually, bringing those lyrics in conversation with music and making songs. And so this is very much a record of songs. It's not me doing readings over. It was taking the poems, changing them into lyrics, and making, and sort of having a movement. So the project kind of stands alone. It's definitely comes out of Nopaming, but you don't need to have engaged with Nopaming in order to appreciate the record. 6 of those poems ended up on the final record, plus 2 other tracks, Okay and Dykes, which was a collaboration with myself and Jim Bryson. And then also I did a cover of I Pity the Country by Willie Dunn. And so Theory of Ice came out in March, and there is a series of short film projects that are related to Theory of Ice. The first one is by Sandra Brewster. So maybe we can move to the next slide, who is a Guyanese Canadian Toronto Black artist. And she did a short film of the track Viscosity. Leslie Split, for those of you who have read the book, is a really important kind of location, a little piece of reclaimed wild in Toronto. And so we wanted to explore kind of Black and Indigenous land-based politics in this film, because particularly during the pandemic, these kind of wild spaces in urban areas became so important for both of our communities. And so Sandra's interpretation of the track is sort of this gorgeous throwback to kind of video art in the 1980s. And we premiered the short film at the AGO, and it's also going to be on the website of the DIA in New York. So I think that we'll watch that film now, and then we'll come back and we'll have a chat.
Disassociated zeros and ones. Too many holes in your hide, the broken skin of a canoe, the brightening of a mind, tracks leading nowhere. At the beach, we build a fire, sit in our own silence, peel off blue light, lie back on frozen waves, breathe in sharp air, warm into each other, careful moment after careful moment. Calling out, calling in, you're not fooling me. Tethered to the kinship of disassociated zeros and ones, shining your crown of neoliberal likes, yelling the loudest in the empty room. We witness. Too many holes in your hide, the broken skin of a canoe, the tightening of a mind, tracks leading nowhere. At the beach, we build a fire, sit in our own silence, peel off blue light, lie back on frozen waves, breathe in sharp air, warm into each other. Careful moment after careful moment. At the beach, we build a fire, sit in our own silence, peel off blue light, lie back on frozen waves, breathe in sharp air, warm into each other. Careful moment after careful moment. At the beach, we build a fire, sit in our own silence, peel off blue light, lie back on frozen waves, breathe in sharp air, warm into each other. Careful moment after careful moment. At the beach, we build a fire, sit in our own silence, peel off blue light, lie back on frozen waves, breathe in sharp air, warm into each other. Careful moment after careful moment. At the beach, we build a fire, sit in our own silence, peel off blue light, lie back on frozen waves, breathe in sharp air, warm into each other. Careful moment after careful moment.
Awesome. So there are 4 more short films that are in production. Carolyn Monet is working on Surface Tension. Amanda Strong is working on The Track Breakup. Synergic is doing OK and Dykes, and Lisa Jackson, Tara Long, and I have just applied for some funding to do a video project for I Pity the Country. So that's a pretty exciting part of this work for me, because that's a pretty incredible roster of Indigenous women to be working with, and to sort of help the novel and the story and the record travel and reach different audiences, and sort of layer these different Indigenous interpretations onto the original work. So we're hoping that the pandemic ends at some point and we're able to play the record live. That would be so amazing. And we're hoping to have these the last 4 videos in the fall. So that's what I've been working on. I'm going to invite Tanya back. and we can be in conversation for a little bit while the audience is thinking up their awesome questions to to ask us. Hi, Tanya.
Hi. Wow. Thank you so much for that incredible presentation. I'm just spending some time like that space on the page. I'm spending absorbing all that you offered. Yeah, I'm struck. Maybe first off, I'm struck by some forgetting that when we originally organized the talk, I had forgotten it was this holiday here in BC, which is Victoria Day. So
right.
is plastered all over a kind of the experience of and ongoing influence of colonization here in the province. But this perhaps the perhaps thinking of forgetting as a type of resistance. I'm thinking of the way in which that you kind of dismissed a lot of conventions in writing in order to get to Nopaming and what these new kinds of ways of relating that story, that experience became. And yeah, I'm thinking about this this way of forgetting as an act, an intentional kind of act, maybe that builds on something around refusal, but also I think allows a different kind of space. To forget is also to kind of release, and I'm thinking of maybe pressures or other kinds of things that we put on ourselves, and it just struck me that I'm glad I forgot.
I'm glad you forgot too.
We went ahead. So
yeah, I feel like that act of forgetting, I think of it often as like just giving what I learned and what I was reminded of in this project, particularly the beginning of Nopaming, was just to give myself permission to write whatever I need in whatever form it takes, and then worry about making it good or thinking about all the things that you need to think about after you have that first draft. But just that giving yourself the freedom to create. I think so many times when I sit down to write or when I sit down to work, I have so many voices in my head directing what should come out on the page. And so clearing that and sort of forgetting all of those conventions and starting with the idea that's coming from within my body is something that's been important to me.
I'm also thinking through the space, especially, which struck me in reading the novel Nopaming. Not just the space on the page, but the space within the words that are there on the page that they, for me, build on these concepts you discuss around world building, that there can be something so precious in that sentence that it opens that door to this totally different experience of story. And I'm thinking too about how stories translated and written by anthropologists, stories I'm familiar with from my family, it can be quite short in the end, but yet there is so much encoded within those stories.
Yeah.
People who work with them then within our language go back in, and just like how you described the Badaban, there's all this nuance and knowledge encoded in those stories. I know we think about John Burroughs, Anishinaabe legal scholars work with story as well, and how story can have, land claims, ecological knowledge, community protocol, all these things within it. And I feel like you allowing that space points to that kind of complexity and layered knowledge.
Yeah, I feel like in coming up with that story, I think that I started with that, like kind of a simple skeleton, and then layered and layered and layered, coming from that aesthetic from our traditional stories. And I also love that. it's one of the ways that our stories and our oral culture has been so dismissed, because on the first glance, particularly if you're coming from a Eurocentric space, the stories look very simplistic, but it gives the storyteller a lot of responsibility in terms of making that story relevant to a contemporary audience and breathing new life into that story, so that the ethics and the politics that are quoted in that story kind of are transmitted to the next generation. And so that, to me, rather than seeing that as sort of a cage or a container, that's always been very generative for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sometimes stories, because they are about animal people or transformers, they can become like, yeah, overly simplified, made into kid stories. But my kids point out this funny experience where I had known one version of this Secwepemc story, and I had at some point mentioned it, summarizing it briefly, and my kids thought it was funny because it was like a PG version of the story, and the one up with in their immersion school. And shout out to all the people working in language and culture so tirelessly in our communities, but we have this amazing immersion school, Chief of Tom School, and so they had the real version, which involved like entrails and blood and a fall off of a cliff, and they knew this since like grade 1, and I think it in some ways underscores the power within that too, that we don't that there's space in that book to not dismiss the kind of power and strength that may be within that line. It involves us in some way, reading.
And I like all of those. I like all of the different versions because they're all a piece. And I think that idea of layering and building up, and I think my ancestors must have been very good at weaving and braiding all of the different versions into a collective or communal understanding. And I think that's sort of a beautiful part of that can be so difficult with when you're writing them down and when you're publishing them, and which version is right, and all of those kind of politics come into it.
Right. The mechanics and the which are so important, but not necessarily the funnest part of the.
That's right.
And of course, you showed us in this talk, and I know from your other work that you have such a collaborative aspect to your practice as well, working with other creators, working with their interpretations, which I think isn't, for some artists, that's not always something they want to, to have a kind of iterative, translation interpretation of their work. And you introduced an amazing roster for upcoming projects. Sandra Brewster's work is amazing. And I wonder if you can just comment on that kind of collaborative nature of your work.
I think that for me, it's a balance. I think that my academic work and sort of writing Nopaming is a very isolating individualist project where I'm making all of the decisions and where my voice is very clear. And I think that that's an important part of it, particularly as an Indigenous woman and as a parent, because so much of the world is invested in me not having a voice or taking away that voice. So I think that that's really, really important, but it's also, I find, isolating. And so the making of the record is an intensely collaborative process where ultimately my voice was the one that made all of the decisions. And I'm working with a lot of solo musicians. So there was a lot of opinions and a lot of perspectives to take into consideration. And I can see where, particularly if you then go and tour and do kind of almost like a durational performance of the album night after night after night, that's going to wear on you. Too. And I think with the film projects, I've been lucky to sort of have these relationships with these artists where I trust them and where I've done my thing in terms of the writing. This is my artistic vision. And now I want to see, where these amazing thinkers and doers and artists go and take the project. And so that, I think it's just about balance. I think if I was always collaborating, I would go insane. And if I was always just alone in my on my screen, I would also go insane.
I relate to that. That was one of the questions we had in our Q&A was also about collaborative process. So I kind of crossed over to that. But there was another follow-up to that, which was around screening the films that are planned. Are you considering screening those as a collection, like in addition to or apart from the record?
Yeah, I think there's some talk about that, because I think in terms of the record, these are not the normal sort of music videos that people make. And so I've really appreciated actually the support of sort of film screenings and film festivals and art galleries in terms of screening the work. My kids are like, have you ever seen a music video, Mom? Because that's not what that is. So yeah, there's some things in the works that once we have them done. I mean, there's been this has not been an easy project because of the pandemic. There's been a lot of delays, and then once now that we're so far into it, then people's time has opened up and we're able to take on things. So yeah, my dream would be to play the album and then screen all the films.
I'm kind of into that show. I think one of the other things I just wanted to pick up on again was maybe that space on the page that you also talked about, the character who's beneath the ice and the frozen lake. And I'm also thinking of experiences in Denenda on the lake there. And I'm wondering, because you also have this committed pedagogical work, this work in teaching and working with Deshinta, Center for Research and Technology. And I wonder if you could talk about a bit around how that experience informs at times the writing, or vice versa, the stories cross over. Like, in what ways are they also related?
I think in lots of ways, this book and this project has been really intensely Anishinaabe. And then with my work with the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning, I'm traveling into Sambake, which is Yellowknife, which is where I am right now, or and Denende, and I'm also learning about things like solidarity and diplomacy and what it's like to work and live for short periods of time in someone else's territory. And so one of the experiences I had as part of my work is I was teaching a course over about 6 weeks in the bush on the land with a lot of wonderful Dene folks and Dene students, and it was during breakup. And so the lake that we were on was spawing, and every day I got to see and hear and feel that transformation, and the sound was insane. It was incredible. And it's something that, of course, where I live happens all the time as well, but because of life, I'm not sitting beside the lake listening, just listening. And so there was sometimes it would sound like thunder, sometimes it would sound very high pitched, other times when the ice sort of started to become loose, it was almost like it was a drum. And there was this resonance. So I think that was pretty influential in terms of theory of ice, because I started to think about water and how it transforms from solid to liquid to gas seamlessly, constantly transforming. There's also this international global water cycle where we're all connected. And it's also inside my body and outside my body. So the boundary of my body in terms of water doesn't exist. So it became something that was really interesting and generative to me. And I wanted to sort of deepen my own relationship to water and my own ideas of thinking of it. So that experience in the north and I also then had the opposite experience of watching the lake freeze. I think really brought my attention to something that I might have missed. I have missed for decades. I've missed it in my own territory.
Yeah, I think that, there's something around visiting, well, even just the act of visiting another territory, and you're in sometimes a different space. You're in this privileged kind of space where you're visiting, and you notice different things than you might in your own territories or your own kind of daily life. So, but I was glad you brought up ice and resonance, because I was thinking in the first video really about a lot of vibration and voice as vibration, and thinking of that sound traveling through the ice, and thinking about your character who's frozen in the lake and under the ice, and that kind of muffled barrier that at times has a real clarity and focus in terms of sound traveling. And the white page being a kind of snow on frozen ice. I'm thinking, referencing also Maureen Grubin, who's a Nuvialuit artist with us in the online artist residency, and she recently gave a talk talking about her work and described her art ice gallery. But I'll have a question I'd like to ask from the chat as well. This is from Christine Howard Sandoval, one of the artists in residence for the Indigenous Art Intensive. And Christine says, can you talk about the transition from written word to spoken word, song and sound composition? Were you working in both ways simultaneously?
So one of the things that has happened to my writing since I have been performing is that I pay attention to sound and I pay attention to audience. So I think that I might have used to be one of those, dusty old professors that just like read their notes at the front of the classroom, and it didn't really matter if the audience like tipped over in exhaustion and boredom, but they just kept on going. Now, after being in a band, if I lose the audience, it's devastating to me. So I spend a lot of time, I think, thinking about sound. I read all my work when I'm writing it out loud. And yeah, I'm working on all of this simultaneously because I don't know, that's just what Leanne does. It's just how it sort of works. In moving from the poetry to lyrics, there's an economy with poetry, and there's a different economy with lyrics. And when you're taking those words on the page, and you'll notice some of the poems are more complex on the page than they end up being in lyrics, because those words are then in conversation with all these other voices and all these other artists and musicians. And so you've got like a bass line, you've got a drum, you've got guitar, music, piano. Music often takes people on a very emotional journey. So in some ways I had to kind of pare back the economy of the words, because the music and the narratives in the music were taking I think listeners on a deeper journey. So it wasn't as easy. It was definitely not, in some of my other work, it has definitely been spoken word over music, and that's not how I made this album at all. We took this group of musicians and I took sort of the lyrics and then, or the poems, and then made them into lyrics and then made them into song, so that it was pretty seamless, I think. I hope that was the idea.
Yeah, amazing. We have another question here. Can you talk about containing the complexities of Anishinaabemowin within English, within writing, the space of writing in English? And the question also acknowledges that you address some of that, of course, throughout the ideas of how the text appears on the page. But the question is wondering if there are other kind of strategies you use in thinking about that. And then they also really love the audiobook of Decolonial Love, read by Tantu Cardinal.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think I'm a language learner. I'm not a very good language learner, in that I've been learning for a long time and I'm still not very proficient. I wanted to take, I think one thing that I noticed is we sort of have the structure of Anishinaabe is geared towards communicating our worldview and our politics and our ethics. And so it's deeply relational, and it communicates our gender, or ideas around gender, for instance. And so I tried to take that idea conceptually and do it in English rather than just sort of leaving it in the language. So that was one of the things that I tried to do. I tried to take this sort of expansive, careful, intricate and specific relationality and communicate it in English. I used a lot of Anishinaabe and didn't translate because I felt like that work can be done by the reader by using the online Ojibwe dictionary from the University of Minnesota. That a lot of the words, you can even hear them being spoken by elder speakers. But I think that folks that know the language will be able to split those words up, and those sort of deeper conceptual meaning stories will be visible to them. And so it is sort of, there's an opaqueness, I think, to the book, that the more you know, the more you'll be able to see, and the more connections you'll be able to see. But if you don't have any experience with Indigenous culture or Anishinaabe, you still will be able to get something out of the book. So I think that layering, and then thinking, just really like learning lots about the language, and then thinking about how to construct those things as best one might be able to in English is something that I think a lot about.
Yeah, because it's challenging to think through that. I'm thinking about a number of Indigenous contemporary artists who employ language in translations of the titles of their work, for example.
Yeah.
And the complexity in thinking, not only the resurgent practice of learning Indigenous language, but also audience,
Right.
Does it change if the work is being shown at some gallery where nobody knows your language versus like in your community where people do,
Yeah.
and then you pay attention more to the conventions of how,
Yeah.
how phonetics or orthography of the language is depicted. I know I've had that experience of thinking like, oh wait, there is people who are going to who are going to read this Wamixgene in this, and I got to make sure it's consistent.
Yeah.
Versus maybe an experience where nobody else is probably going to know. And so, yeah, I'm struck by that way of thinking through different audience and different venues and spaces. And I guess like story also in your work, story also is interpretive in the sense that somebody hears a story and might carry it and describe it to somebody else, and these kinds of ways in which story distributes itself. And how storytellers, interpret story in different ways, thinking through traditional stories. And I guess I'm sort of like curious about, I don't know if it makes sense to say an ideal audience, but how you might intend for some of the stories to be carried. I don't know if that's too abstract a question or too.
I think I'm sort of interested in engagement, and I think that's how I measure my success is how engaged folks are with the work, and sort of on what level they become engaged, and what, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about meaning and the kind of meaning I was communicating, knowing that it's sort of almost like a treated or a relational situation where other artists and readers and listeners are going to bring their own meaning and their own interpretations to the work, and that's sort of part of the deal. So I think that I try to make things that mean something to me, and that's sort of one of the things that I think is really important to me. And then I try to make it where it doesn't necessarily need to be loved or liked by people, but it's interesting to me when they are able to engage it or find it generative or find it inspiring or use it as a jumping off point, or it propels them in some way to see the world differently, or it affirms the way that they do see the world, and it enables them to sort of to make something or do something. I think that's beautiful when that happens.
It brings me to thinking of your other book, As We Have Always Been, in terms of thinking through strategies of resistance as kind of action and affirmation. I think I experienced a lot of affirmation in reading. And in particular, there's a chapter in that book where you talk a lot about contemporary Indigenous art practice. You talk about a performance by Rebecca Belmore. I just mentioned that because we have the Rebecca Belmore piece Fringe on your book cover as well.
Right.
And there was something really affirmative about reading through, and this, for other authors as well, but reading through this idea of aesthetics as a kind of ecology, I think, as a having these systems of connection, and you mentioned this a few times around world building or creating the conditions for life. And I think that at times it's what's missing for me in the sterile white cube gallery model is this sense of ecology, and so that relationality, like you mentioned, through different human, non-human, direct relationships with the land. And I'm not sure it's a question, but I'm just just speaking to that chapter is really important to me because, having gone through, university art programs, bachelor's and master's or whatever, the transition in that time period for me, 20 years or so, was that there was all of a sudden Indigenous writers who were speaking about contemporary art, who were writing maybe not directly as critics, but giving space to contemporary art practice. And so, and you introduced also a number of artists, Nadia Mayer, other artists, Leanne, Charlie, through your work. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about that work with as you have done with musicians, that work with artists.
I think that affirmation piece is really important when I'm thinking about my own self and my own development as a writer and as a musician and as an Indigenous woman. It was really important to have other Indigenous women writers and artists and musicians affirm, I think, the things that I thought, my experiences, what it was like to be an Indigenous woman. That was something that I felt like lifted up or felt relief. It gave me something. And so I think one of the reasons why Rebecca Belmore's work is always in my work is because she was one of the people that did that for me. I always feel very seen as an Anishinaabe in her work. And that's an experience that's rare for me, whether I'm engaged in art or music or academics. I don't feel very affirmed. And so I wanted my work to have that kind of quality for Anishinaabe people and for Indigenous people, but I didn't want it to end there, because I think it's almost like you breathe out. I'm not crazy. I'm not the problem. This is not my fault. I'm not a victim. And then the conversation can begin, or then the story can begin. And so that's something quite different than if you're writing for white audiences, or you're making art and you have to fit into the white cube, because you're always having to engage in this level of translation and almost, I think, a dumbing down of your work, so that the kind of lowest common denominator, folks that have absolutely no understanding of our history, our aesthetics, our intellectual traditions, our artistic practices, can get it. And I really resisted that in this book. I was like, it is okay if folks who have no idea that Anishinaabe people exist in Ontario understand this work, because I'm not writing it for them. And I want affirmation, I want inspiration, I want generative, I want I want to speak to the brilliance of my people, and I don't want to water that down or dumb that down or over explain that or compromise on that. And that's okay if the book isn't successful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's a big, thing as well, to think like, it's okay if it's not successful, give the space to make those other kinds of forms, which is
Yeah.
not always easy in any, creative practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
I know Richard Van Camp said that one time, writer Richard Van Camp, who talked about the importance of giving permission through just, right? So
Yeah.
just example, and nothing kind of further than that, just that affirmation that that person has done it and followed that path, and then you can probably find your way on that path as well, bring
Yeah.
your machete to help clear it, but you can probably find your way. Oh, well, it's been such a pleasure to talk about some of these ideas in your work. And you're in Denenda, and what's next for you in the next little while?
I'm in quarantine, and so I'm hoping to get out of quarantine in a week, and then I will be attending a hide camp here. I think I'm working on those 4 videos. I'm hoping that the pandemic allows for live performance again. And I'm working on a book. Well, the book is finished with Robin Maynard called Rehearsals for Living, and it's we're sort of getting into the production stage of the book. It's coming out in next March, so I'll be working on that as well. Yeah.
Amazing. And that's a really exciting title, coming up with Robin Maynard. Did you want to briefly introduce Robin for listeners here? Because this is another collaboration. We talked about collaboration with musicians, collaboration with artists, and collaborations with authors. This is another.
Yeah, Robin is a Black writer, abolitionist, organizer, academic theorist, feminist. Based in Toronto. She wrote a book called Policing Black Lives, which is just a really, really important book in terms of Canada. And we wrote each other letters during the pandemic. And we're dorks, so there's a lot of footnotes and academic engagement in our letters. But writing through sort of the global uprising of Black Lives Matters, of COVID-19, we had a relationship before, and we sort of were planning on a kind of a series of activities in terms of solidarity and relationship building that got canceled because of COVID-19. And so we spent about 6 to 8 months writing letters back and forth, and that became this book. Rehearsals of Living is a phrase that comes from the Black abolitionist and academic and writer Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. And yeah, so it's sort of conversations on abolition and anti-colonialism, written in this sort of very, I think, Black feminist methodology of scaffolding the intimate and the individual, and using it to critique and comment on systems. So it's been I feel like it's the project that really saved me through the pandemic, just being able to engage in these letters with Robin, and it was a really beautiful process.
I think that is so reflective of the time we're in terms of the uprisings in Palestine and protests in BC at Fairy Creek, with people defending old growth forests. And I think that it's those intersectional ties between anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, abolition are such important spaces to think about, right? I have one more. I have just maybe one or
sure.
Question, if we have some time. I know you've given us so much time. I'm so appreciative of that today. But I think this is an important question. It also strikes me again in the book, as we have always done. There's a really important chapter. I know you quote a longtime friend, Sarah Hunt, and some of her work as a Kwakwaka'wakw scholar. And this is a question from Ari, who really just describes that around that affirmative writing, that they really appreciate representation of identity that is not meant to cater to the hegemonic norm. And can you talk about your strategies to resist that? And I'm bringing in, my part of the question is bringing in that chapter that I think is really critical and important around thinking about queer, two-spirit, trans identities and their, their critical relationship to Indigenous thought, to ways in which we need to carry that so strongly in our communities against a lot of homophobia, transphobia, and things that are, that are real in both urban communities and in rural on reserve communities.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot about light, and I think that in Anishinaabe thought, there's lots of ways that you can view our culture through the lens of a colonial gender binary. So day, night, man, woman, grandmother, moon, grandfather, son, all of those types of things. And there are lots and lots of ways that you can ungender that as well, particularly in the language. So I sort of thought about the way light happens from Badabin to noon, to evening time, to night. And at every point in the day, at every point in the circle, there's a different amount of light. And so that reminds me that it's not just day, night, man, woman. It's a spectrum where there's room for everybody. And not only is there room for everybody, it's crucial that we practice our Indigenous practices, our ceremonies, our stories in a way where everybody feels like they can be their best selves. And so that sort of became the basis of rejecting transphobia and homophobia and heteropatriarchy and all of this kind of imposition on dress, on how one lives their gender or their name or whatever. And I think practicing ceremony and practicing Anishinaabe life that way, I think, makes strong families and makes strong communities, because when you have everybody with their feet on the ground, not suffering from trauma and violence, but being able to be their best selves, that's good for the collective and that's good for the community, and it's the right thing to do. So I think I really want to have those ideas reflected in the worlds that I build in my fiction and in my music and in the films and in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. That idea of world building is still such a strong, resonant part of your work and the talk and your collaborations, the complexity of those, and the ways in which perhaps they reverberate onward. I think, at the end of one poem, when you're talking about there's always stars, this ways in which those vibrations, that resonance continues to build, points towards growth too. I think this idea of that I'm really taken with, this idea of like, how do we create ecologies, abundance within our worlds, similar to how do we be our best selves, how do we give people what they need so that we can all contribute all the amazing skills that each person has in their own way. I really want to thank you, Leanne, for spending time with us this afternoon in quarantine and Denenda, but in also all of your heart and your words and what you've given us to carry from story, from poetry, from music, from resonance in your work. I know that I'm grateful for what you offer in your work, and not only what you offer, but what you firmly and assertively claim as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to visit with you and to share space with everybody who came today. And I wish everyone good health and a good residency. Lots of creative ideas. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again. For people who are wondering, this session is available. There will be a recording of the YouTube live stream, and yeah, we'll get a chance to sit with the rest of that page that you allow us to sit with. Thank you so much, Leanne, for joining us today. I want to say thank you in my language. And yeah, I look forward to seeing these films as you work on them, and to also all the artists in residence who are with us, to seeing the research and work that you're developing through this time period. So amazing. Just really thank you again. And yeah, I guess this is we'll leave it. Thank you again, Leanne.
Miigwech, go up in.
Jam.